So welcome to our webinar on how to create a recruitment brief. This is going to be part of a series. We're going to be doing more webinars to share our knowledge and expertise on user recruitment to support and empower a growing UX community. So I'm Jess Lewes from People for Research, and we're very lucky to have with us Emma Howell, who is going to discuss the intricacies of creating a user recruitment brief. Emma's the Research Director at cxpartners. cxpartners are a user experience design consultancy with offices in Bristol and London. And Emma's been running research for over 10 years and has worked with a really broad range of clients. So the idea to start a webinar series really came out of a co-blog with Emma, which made me consider the process our clients go through when creating a brief and the uses it has in bringing together anyone involved in the research project, from designers to stakeholders, as well as being a tool, of course, informing the person that's doing the recruitment, whether that be an agency or someone internally to the organisation. So what are we going to cover today? We're going to cover the purpose of a brief for user recruitment. We're going to talk about how to write a good brief. We'll go through the timeframes that are important to consider and a few GDPR considerations on the process. So we're going to start with the purpose of a brief. So I'll just talk briefly about the purpose from a recruiter's point of view, and this is just going through the fundamental sort of things that really should be included in a brief. So it's the foundation that we build from. It should clearly outline what type of people are required, using language that's not open to interpretation. For me, the brief acts as a reference throughout the recruitment process, and we will always check back to make sure that each participant meets the requirements as laid out in that briefing document. Plus, it's also a useful aid when communicating with your client. It provides essential information to help plan the recruitment, for example, when and where. We've also created an infographic, which we've got a link to later on in the webinar, that just goes through the basics. So if you're new to the process and don't really know where to start when writing a brief, this might be a good point for you. So I always say it's who, what, where, why, when, how, all of the open questions. So who is focused on your user needs, and anything that might be open to interpretation, and be specific with any language you're using. What are you testing, and what devices do the participant need to have experience with? Where the session is, the location might have an impact on whether people can attend, particularly in a city like London, if it's one side or the other. When it's taking place, so ideally set a date at the start of the process so that people know, again, if they need to take time off work. Why you're testing or doing research, which Emma's going to go on to in a moment, to help give context to the project, and how you're going to run the research, so if it's remote or in person, etc. At this point, I'm going to hand over to Emma to go through her role on the brief and the role that it plays for a user researcher or a UX designer involved in research and user recruitment.
Thanks.
Hand over.
Thank you very much, Jess. Cool. So the things that I'm going to talk about today are, as Jess has said, so from a UX's point of view, what's the purpose of a recruitment brief? And then I want to talk through some of the activities that we do at cxpartners when we're in the process of writing that brief. So hopefully by the end, people will be able to take away some sort of tips and ideas about how they might go about writing recruitment briefs. And is it worth mentioning that we have saved some time at the end for questions? Yeah. So throughout, if people do have questions, then feel free to fire them over, and we will get to as many as we can at the end. So the purpose of a brief. So I've pulled out 4 here on this slide, and I'm sure there's probably more that people can think of, which I'd be really willing to hear, actually, if anyone's got thoughts. But for me, over and above telling your recruiter who it is that you want to speak to, a recruitment brief can serve a few more purposes than that, I think. Mm. So first of all, what a brief should do, as well as telling a recruiter who it is that you want to talk to, it should give background to your research as well. So thinking about explaining what you're doing and why, as you just mentioned in your infographic, Jess. The process of going through writing a brief also forces you to do a few things. So when you're thinking about your research, it forces you to think about what your objectives are. So with this bit of research, what is it actually that we want to learn and why, and how are we going to do that? And then when you know your objectives, you can then think about, right, so this is what we want to know, this is why we want to know it, who is it that we need to talk to so that we can get answers to them questions. And then the final thing that I've pulled out there is the recruitment brief. It's a shared space for you and your recruiter, and an understanding of who it is that everyone's going out to look for, really. So it's a place where you can both go back to and base your conversations and understanding around. So I just wanted to go into each of these in a little bit more detail, just to explain what my thinking. So giving backgrounds to your research, I think it's really, really important to give your recruiter context. Because I often think about it, if I was told to do a little bit of research and I was told what research to do, but I wasn't told why I was doing it, I'd find that really difficult to do. So I can imagine that it would be quite similar for a recruiter. And I think it doesn't have to be hugely detailed, but it does have to give your recruiter enough of an understanding so that they can be like, right, okay, I understand this project, I know what they're doing, and so I understand why they're looking for this type of person or these type of people. And giving that shared foundation and understanding of research to a recruiter helps build your understanding, I hope, if we do it right. And I think what I've found on projects is that ultimately means that your recruiter has a lot more confidence in making decisions. So when you're looking at potential participants, the more that you understand about my research, the more able you will be to make a decision on if someone is right or wrong. Why that's good from my point of view, as well as hopefully making your life a bit easier, is it means that it can save me a little bit of time, because you won't have to jump on the phone so much to me to check, we've got this person, how does that sound? You'll have that understanding to make them decisions for yourself. So I think that's good for everyone. So the next point that I pulled out was deciding on your objectives. So when you start thinking about writing a recruitment brief, you really need to think about your research. So why are we doing this? What do we want to learn? What's the scope of our research, and what are we okay with maybe not learning for now we can come back to in the future? Think through your assumptions and hypotheses, and I think with my recruitment, what I always try and do is recruit in a way that will challenge and test them hypotheses. So if I have a certain assumption about a set of users, well, how can I use recruitment to really sort of rag that idea of mine and make sure that any conclusion that I come to at the end, whether that's supporting that hypothesis or disregarding that hypothesis, I can be really confident in them findings. When it comes to research objectives, the other thing that's worth thinking about is what it is that you need to deliver at the end of your project. So that helps you plan your research, and it also helps you plan your recruitment as well. So in discovery research, so I'm thinking to times when we've worked with Bristol City Council, for example, at cxpartners, there have been big discovery pieces of research. So for that, as an example, we worked with the homelessness team. So we needed to hear lots of stories from people about their experiences of homelessness and the journeys they'd gone through, their different touch points with the council and their needs and pain points. So for that type of research, we were looking to recruit sort of 20 plus people for that. For smaller projects or projects where perhaps we are working in sprints and we're testing designs, or we may only need 5 or 6 people for that sort of work. So that can really help sort of shape your recruitment and think about who it is that you need to speak to and how many that you need to speak to. And then the final point I've got on there related to objectives of the research is about feasibility. And more often than not for us, that basically means how much time have we got to do the research and the recruit, and how much money have we got to do it, because that will really influence the type of recruitment that you can do, the type of research that you want to run, and really how much time a recruiter has to find the type of person that you're looking for. So the more tricky the recruit, more niche the type of people that you're looking for, you need to give your recruiter more time so that they can find them people. So then on to forcing you to segment your audience. So this is something else that writing a recruitment brief will sort of force me to do really thoroughly, actually, when I'm writing a brief. And that's thinking about, so I can't speak to everyone, unfortunately, all of the customers of this product or service. So thinking about the research that I'm doing, who is it important for me to speak to right now and who can I leave out and come back to? So I've recently done that. So we're working with Talk to Frank at the moment, who are a service that provides information about drugs for people. So we knew from quite early on from our client that there's two very broad users of that website. So there's people that are considering using drugs themselves, and then there are people that are worried about the drug use of, let's say, a friend or family member. So we made a decision very early on that the first sprint or so would focus on the group that were interested in drugs information for themselves, rather than someone that was worried about someone else. That wasn't because that group wasn't important or relevant, they really were. It just meant that we could focus our research and recruitment in that first sprint, and to really nail down them sort of parts of the site, and then we could come back to the design challenges of the concerned others, we called them at a later date. So once you've thought about, okay, so we're focusing on Talk to Frank on this group of people that are interested in drugs information for themselves, well then you really need to dig into, how can I explain that type of person to my recruiter? What are the behaviours and characteristics of someone in that group, and how can I tell you that so that you know who to go out and find? So I'm going to go into that in a lot more detail a little bit later on, and share some of the activities that we do to dig into that. And this was the final purpose of a recruitment brief that I pulled out, and that's having a shared place for us, recruiter and UXer, to communicate. So it's a place where you've both agreed that this is who we're looking for, this is who I need for my research, and here are the reasons why. And as you mentioned, Jess, as a recruiter, it's a point of reference for you. So when you've got people applying to take part in the research, you can go back to the brief. And as long as we've been clear, hopefully that allows you to say, yes, that person's a good fit, and we'll help them do their research, or perhaps not for this little bit of research as well. So for me, that was, the purpose of a recruitment brief, above and beyond telling a recruiter who I want and why. There were some other things that sort of come out of that process. So then I wanted to talk about, how do you write a good brief then? What goes into writing a good brief? And I think it's taken a while, actually, to get my head around this. And I think we're still constantly tweaking it. We're still constantly having conversations with recruiters about what they need and what's helpful and useful to have in a brief. But it feels like we've got to a good place where we can sort of share some of our tips that will hopefully help other people. So before I dig into writing a brief, I thought it worth stepping back for a minute, actually, and thinking about where writing a brief actually sits on that much bigger timeline of recruitment, all the way through to doing your research. Because actually, most things happen at least 2 weeks before we're doing our research. So we generally work, if we can, with it in mind that a recruiter needs at least 2 weeks to find the people that we need to do our research. So there's a whole heap of stuff that happens before we actually sit down to write the brief. So that timeline there, I'm going to roughly work through each of these and talk through what we do at each step. So the very first thing that we do when we know that a bit of work is coming in that we're going to have to do a bit of research for is we ring the recruiter. And at this stage, and it'd be good to know your thoughts, Jess, but I don't worry too much about how much I know at that point about the research. I just like to say, Jess, right, we've got a bit of work with this client coming up. We think we're going to need this type of person. And I think that it does a number of things if you do that. It's politeness, I think, for the recruiter. It gives them a heads up so that you know that something's coming up. So perhaps if it's a group of people that you may not have many of on your database, you can start thinking about, well, how are we going to find these people? How are we going to go and advertise and access that group? And it gives you time to prepare, and that ultimately means that you're more likely to be able to recruit the people that we want for our research. I think the other side of it for me is it is a perfect time to start asking for advice and guidance and really leaning on the expertise of your recruiter, because more often than not, your recruiter will have done something very similar to what it is that you're trying to do. So again, back to the Talk to Frank example, that's just so fresh in my head. But when that project come in, I remember going for a coffee with Vicky and just saying, right, I know that we've got this project coming in. I'm going to need to talk to people about drug use. I was concerned about that because I was like, are people even going to want to talk to me about, what they get up to at the weekends? And she was able to sort of give advice based on previous recruits that she'd done. And then the other side of it is that we were aware that we needed to talk to young adults, so we were able to sort of lean on her for guidance on how best to sort of approach that. So from very early on, and this was really probably about 4 or 5 weeks before we actually did the research, we started having conversations with the recruiter so that they could help us shape not only the recruitment brief, but the research that we were doing as well. So after calling and chatting to a recruiter, the next thing that we would do is really then start thinking about the details of what's going to go into the recruitment brief. And this can be more tricky for some projects than others. Sometimes it can be quite straightforward and you just need anyone that's bought a pair of shoes, in the past 6 months. But for other recruits, it can be a lot more difficult and you've got certain criteria that you need to hit. So what I'm going to do on the next few slides is talk about the things that we think about at cxpartners and then some of the activities that we use to help us really nail the details that go into a recruitment brief. So the first thing that I would start thinking about is this idea of validity against achievability. So what I mean by validity is thinking about, so are these people or is this person going to be a good reflection of the customers or users and what they're going to do? As I mentioned, because we can't speak to everyone, I need to be confident that that small sample of people that I ask you to recruit for me are reflective of the bigger population. And then the other side of that is thinking about achievability. So how realistic is it that you can find the people that you want for your recruit, but the other side of that is that they're recruitable as well, that they're going to want to take part in research, or that you're going to offer the most appropriate incentive for them to take part and give you their thoughts. So let's say, for example, you were working on a project that was looking at astronauts and their use of social media in space. It's a bit of a flippant example, but I hope that it sort of highlights the point. With that type of project, you'd probably struggle to meet the criteria of that, I would imagine. I don't know how many astronauts you've got on your database. So it would be the achievability of that recruit would be quite difficult. So what you'd want to do for that type of recruit is slightly relax the criteria. So could you talk to people that were thinking about becoming an astronaut or that were in training to become an astronaut, for example? But on the other hand, what you wouldn't want to do is just chat to your mates down the pub, because they're not going to have the thought processes or understanding that you want from astronauts. So your mates wouldn't be a valid sample. So for most projects, it really is a bit of a balance between the two. And I think the point that I wanted to make with this is, with recruitment, you can be fussy, I think, in that you can be quite clear on who you want, but you can't be a perfectionist about it. There's going to need to be a degree of flex in your recruitment somewhere along the line. So once I've had a think about that, I then start thinking about, right, I know roughly at a very high level the group of people that I want to talk to. How do I then really start drilling into who these people are and how I describe them, and how does my recruiter identify them? So I've pulled out, there's 3 ways that we do this at cxpartners. So the first one is a bit of desk research. So I might look at forums, I might read reviews of the product or service or similar products or services, just to get a bit of a lay of the land, and to start getting an understanding of the type of people that may be engaging with the product or the service. And the other thing that I would do is I'd start talking to my friends or family, even people in the office, if they have an understanding of that group of people. So an example would be project that I worked on, it's probably about a year and a half ago now. So we were working with a client who was interested in people's attitudes towards sharing data or their personal information online in exchange for rewards. So their hypothesis was that people who are hardcore gamers would be more willing to share their data online. So sharing things like bank information, or it could be health information, income. That were the sort of things they were thinking of. So I took that, and then we thought, okay, what's a hardcore gamer? I used to game when I was younger, but I haven't for years. I don't know what that means. So by talking to people around the office, there are a few that do game, and they were able to talk to me about things that I hadn't heard of. So it became apparent, so for a hardcore gamer, they might use things such as Twitch, which is a website, I think I'm right in saying, where you can watch people play video games, or you can stream yourself playing video games. Hardcore gamers might play certain types of game. They might buy games as soon as they come out, in comparison to casual gamers who may only play the big releases, and they may only buy a new game, I don't know, once every few months. So just by having them conversations, it started to help me sort of whittle down and get an understanding of what a hardcore gamer looks like. As an aside, that hypothesis was wrong. They were not more willing to share their data than anyone else. So there was a lot of other stuff that was coming into play. So that's desk research. The other thing that you can do is stakeholder interviews. So that's just having a chat with people. So that might be internal project teams or clients about any data that they might hold on customers or users. That's from, is there any previous research that you can take a look at, which we've done quite a lot with clients recently. Or are there any other sort of broader reports that you can look at? So back to that sort of data sharing one that I was talking about. We've had a few projects like that, clients that are interested, especially after GDPR, in data sharing and how you make people feel comfortable. And out of that research, we started seeing trends in our findings. And we wanted to know if that was reflective of what everyone else was finding. So we went out and found some more wider reports that had been done by some European companies, just to sort of sense check our understanding of these groups of people. And in that case, it did seem to match up with what they were sort of finding. But that just helped, I think, for me, to have confidence in my assumptions about these groups of people. The other thing that you can do is a workshop with post-it notes, because UXers don't do enough of that. So with this workshop, what we'd do is we would get stakeholders. Thank you. I forgot that was get stakeholders in the room, or whoever's on the project team, and I would. So on the next slide, slide 17. So I'd get them to then write down all of the different variables that they can think of. And by variables, it's just a bit of a fancy word for saying different characteristics, behaviours or traits that you might be interested in people for this bit of research. So on this slide, I've pulled out some examples from some recent bits of research that we've done. So in this example, we might be interested in location, so where someone's living, whether or not someone's a parent, their expertise level, what kind of devices they own. So it really could be anything. So we just sort of chuck all of them out on a post-it note. Then what we would do is we would start to arrange them post-it notes. And we generally try to arrange them in these 3 columns. So we go for our essential column, or primary variables, if you want to use the flashy words. So we would recommend no more than 2 in that column. So they are the 2 things that are absolutely crucial for your participants to have in that recruit. So for this, we've pulled out family and user type. And they're things that you may be able to give a little bit on, but really it's quite important the way that you define them in your brief is as strictly adhered to as is possible in the recruit. In the next column, we would put our important characteristics or traits, and we tend to put around 7, no more than 7 in here. So they're things that they are important and we're interested in, but it's not absolutely critical to the bit of research that we're running in. And then everything else goes in a bit of a nice to have column. So I'll talk through later on. I'll show a template of a recruitment brief that we use, and I'll sort of talk through where these bits go in that. So the previous exercise, the workshop exercise that I just showed there, is it can then start helping you plan about the number of people that you want to talk to, which is important to tell your recruiter how many people do you need. So I think this helps explain as well why we would suggest only really using 2 primary variables. So as you can see, from just having 2 in there, we've ended up with 18 participants, just from sort of linking up all of them different variables. So along the top there, we've got usage. And in this example, we've got people that are regular users, people that are occasional users, and then we've got lapsed users. Our other primary variable is about having children at home. So if they have young family, older family, or no children at home at all. So the point of this is just to highlight visually, I think, that the more complicated you recruit, the more criteria that you add, the harder it's going to be to find these very specific people that you then start asking for. And that can obviously impact how successful your recruit is and how difficult you're making that job for your recruiter. So it really is worth thinking about what is absolutely essential for me in this recruit and what are the things that we can be a bit more flexible on. So this is moving on a little bit from defining the sample. So I've spoken through activities that sort of start digging you down into thinking about the type of people that you want to talk to. And so in the previous example, I think I pulled out things like, so we know that location's important, and we know that devices used are important. Well, once you know that, you then really need to start getting specific about, well, what kind of devices are we interested in, or what equipment do we want someone to be using that's going to be good for our recruit. So I think I've pulled out a few here that we think about on this slide. So type of things that we would think about going into detail on would be any specific activities, behaviours, or maybe even equipment that they might use or have. So thinking about, did a project once for a ski holiday website. So we started looking at things like how regularly people book their ski holidays, whether they do group bookings, individual bookings, what type of equipment do they own, what type of brands are they aware of, so that we could then start to segment them into people that were, I guess, experts. Skiers isn't quite the right thing, but compared to sort of more novice ski holiday bookers, because that was what we were interested in for that recruit. So it's definitely worth thinking through that. Also think about how frequently you want them behaviours to occur. So for some projects, it might be okay that someone buys, I don't know, new skis once every few years. But for some projects, you might want people that are buying a new iPhone every time it comes out. It depends what your research is looking into, but it's definitely worth being specific about how frequently you want that activity or behaviour to occur. That kind of links on to the next point about expertise, because it's definitely worth thinking about expertise level. And it is important, I think, to recruit experts in research sometimes. So by experts, I mean people that have, that may be pros at using the product or the service that you're doing research with, or that have used that thing for a long time. But just be cautious of using too many. I'm sure that's advice that you'd give us, Jess. Just because they'll bias and skew your results a little bit. So it's worth getting a spread of expertise from experts all the way down to total newbies to the product or service that you're testing. A really big one for us at the moment at cxpartners is all around making our recruitment inclusive. So by that I mean making sure that we're recruiting and speaking to really diverse range of people, and that we're making sure that we are accessibility testing as well. And that's come out of, we're doing a lot of government projects at the moment, and you're assessed at different stages of that. And part of that assessment is based on, have you accessibility tested this service? So we're ensuring that in every bit of research that we do, there's someone with a visual impairment, so someone that's accessing the site or service with a screen reader, so that we can make sure that anything we're designing is usable with a screen reader. We're thinking of things like people who are dyslexic, people who have mobility considerations of the arms and hands, because that will influence or affect how they're interacting with the thing that we're designing. So I'd really encourage people to think about that as well. So how can you make your recruitment and your research inclusive? Think about context of the interaction with the thing that you're testing. So it might be, I don't know, I always think back to this time when I was using Trainline on my phone. I was pegging it through a tube station, and I'd realised that I hadn't booked onto the train I was running for, and I needed to get back to Bristol. So I was on Trainline, running through the tube like that, and I was thinking, it made me think about the type of testing that we do at CX. And sometimes we'll have people quite calmly sitting down using a website, or you might be testing Trainline. But I think about how can you recruit to replicate maybe them sort of instances where it is a bit more on the go. What would that mean for your recruitment and how you do your research? And then the final point is avoiding professional research participants. And I've found with good recruiters, they will do that anyway. They'll know to screen out people that are taking part in research really frequently. But it's just something to be aware of, because they will tend to think they know what you want to hear, and it will tend to bias your research. So I would sort of steer clear of them. So that was all about nailing the details of what needs to go into a recruitment brief. And now comes the fun bit. This is where you actually get to write the recruitment brief. So as I mentioned in the beginning, there's probably about a week's worth at least of activities that have gone on before I get to this point, before I sit down and decide to sort of write something to send over to a recruiter. So hopefully that's given people a bit of an idea about how we go about doing it. So I thought that I would speak through a template that we use for our recruitment brief. So I wouldn't worry so much about what it is that we've popped in there, but hopefully the sections will help understand what it is that we send over. So at the top of our recruitment brief, we tend to put the logistics in. So like you mentioned earlier, you need to know when it's happening. Yeah. You need to know where it's happening. So the address, where are you sending your participants? And then you need to know what slots we have available. So what times are we trying to fill? And then we'll look at things like research exclusions. So that would be things like, so talk to Frank, thinking about that. We didn't want anyone that was an expert drug user, so someone that uses drugs too frequently. That wasn't who we were looking for. So we were quite clear, anyone that uses recreational drugs every weekend, they're not quite appropriate for this bit of research that we're doing. Also for that recruit, we, for various reasons, we needed to talk to people in the north of England, so we wanted to exclude anyone from the south of England. Then the next big chunk is around, we call it the criteria, but this is really where we pull in, when I was talking about the primary variables or the essential variables and the important variables, that's where we pull that information in and hopefully explain it in a way that's understandable to our recruiter. So oftentimes we will segment into different groups. So it could be we have expert users and we have new users, and then within the explanations we'll explain. So an expert user, so going back to the example of the data sharing and the gamers, an expert user will use Twitch each week. They'll buy a new game each week. And new users, they may not have heard of Twitch and they only buy sort of mainstream games once every 6 months. So that's where we'd start explaining that sort of information. And then coming down to the bottom, we have a section that says all. And that's where I would drop in some of the nice to haves from the column. So sometimes that might be age. So it's not critical that we recruit to a certain age, but it could be useful for us to know, just so we have an understanding of the spread of people that we've got coming in. So we sort of just pop that in there so that the recruiter knows the other types of information we'd be interested in them collecting. And then along the bottom there, we've got the incentive that we're offering, and that's often we look to recruiters for guidance on that as well. So what type of incentive would you recommend is appropriate for this type of person that we're looking for? Is cash the most appropriate thing, or could we offer, I don't know, a donation to charity or an Amazon voucher? We'd look for a little bit of help on that. So that's the template that we use for our recruitment. And I have asked Jess for feedback on it actually in the past, so I'm hoping it's okay and the recruiters find it all right. But I think I often find myself going back to it and just, it's worth checking with recruiters that you are including what it is that they need to do their job, and if there's anything you could expand on, maybe stuff that you put in that they don't need. I think it's worth being very open and honest with your recruiter and inviting that sort of feedback. Right, so I've written my wonderful brief on my amazing template, and then I would send it. I'd send it over to the recruiter. And I wouldn't just sling it at a recruiter, actually. I think it's polite to give them a ring as well, for a number of reasons. I think recruitment briefs are really difficult to write, and it is so easy to get them wrong, and very easy to not explain yourself, or not quite explain behaviours, or be unclear on the type of people that you're looking for. So when we sit on these calls, we'd step through the brief. Often the recruiter will reflect back to me their understanding of the people that they think that I'm looking for, and then that helps for me to say, oh no, that's not quite what I meant. What I actually meant was this. And then it starts to help build that understanding that I spoke about at the beginning, about the research and what it is that we're doing and why. And now we're digging into the people and who I need. I'd also ask for any input. So if there's anything that the recruiter would recommend changing or tweaking, that might find us better people for our research, or might make the chances of us having a successful recruit more likely, I'd be looking for input on that as well. And then on that call, we'd finalise it as well. So sometimes I may have to go away, edit the brief, and then resend a final version. But that's where we both sort of confirm and say, right, yes, we both understand who it is that we're looking for. I'm happy, you're happy, and then we're ready to start recruitment. And the other thing that we might talk about on that call as well is talking about updates and how often do you want to be in touch. So if it's a relatively straightforward recruit, I myself would be quite happy to have quite limited contact, so just perhaps seeing a potential participant when they're coming in to confirm. But for more difficult recruits, then I would definitely want a little bit more contact, and maybe even to just sort of check in every few days. I even find that helpful if there's no update and no one's been found yet. I think probably what I'm looking for is just reassurance for you to be like, it's all right.
Just to work on
it. Yeah, and just to be saying like, we've reached out to these people, we're doing this, we're doing that. It's just, I guess, for me, so that I feel that I understand what's going on and that things are happening and it's all okay. And there's nothing that I need to do, I guess, as well, because sometimes your recruiter may come to you and say, look, we're really struggling to find this type of people, thinking about age. Can we try and look for people up to this age range? And more often than not, we can be like, yeah, that would be okay as well. We can flex a little bit on that, and then sometimes you find they then flood in and you've got your participants. So this next slide, it kind of nods actually onto what I was just talking about, and this is from the blog that we co-wrote on writing a recruitment brief. And I think I've found with some recruiters, they will take your recruitment brief as gospel. So once I've sent it, that's it. It's on lockdown. And sometimes that can be okay. Sometimes that can be quite challenging. I think my preferred way of working is seeing the recruitment brief as somewhat more fluid than that. So that's by having conversations with recruiters such as yourself. You allow that brief to be quite fluid. So we will be constantly talking, and if there's any difficulties that you're coming against, we can chat about where we can flex or maybe change things, or if there's anything that we might want to tweak that might be okay tweaking in the recruitment, I feel like I could come and just say that, and we could have a chat about it. And I think that's probably something worth bearing in mind with some recruiters, is that it doesn't necessarily have to be 100% set in stone. There is flex, and there's going to be times when you're going to need to flex in your recruit so that you fill your research slots. So I wanted to give, because there's a lot of things that I've just spoken about, I was very aware of that. So there was a few things that I just wanted to give an overview of. And the first one is an overview of timings. And I think I've mentioned this a few times, in that most stuff that I've spoken about happens at least 2 weeks before we're testing. So that's around 3, perhaps even more than 3 weeks before I'm doing the research. I'll give the recruiter a call just to tell them that something's coming. I might not know exactly what, but I've got a rough idea, and here is what I know, so that everyone can start getting ready and prepped for it. I'll draft a brief and I'll send that to the recruiter, follow that up with a call as well. Probably constantly be having conversations, sometimes over email, sometimes more calls as well, just so that we're tweaking and finalising the brief and both very clear on what's happening. And then once the brief has been sent over, then conversations have been had, then there's that final call where you just sort of step through the brief, everyone finalises that they're happy with what's happening, and the recruitment starts. Then this is kind of linked to what I just spoke about, but this is more of the detail, I guess, of the communications, because it's something that I've spoken to people about, and I suppose when I started research, I didn't know everything that went into a recruitment brief, and I just kind of thought you write a brief, you give it to a recruiter, and then off I pop until these participants magically appear. But actually, there's a lot more communication that goes into good recruitment anyway than just that. So I have mentioned all of this, but just to summarise, so before sending the brief over, there's that call at the beginning just to say I've got this bit of research coming up, just to let you know, get ready. And then I'd also ask for help and advice and ask, based on your experience of doing similar recruits in the past, who would you recommend we test with? How would you segment these people? Is there anything that we should be aware of that was tricky in the past for you in that recruit that we can learn from? Then when I've sent the brief, we have a kick-off call with the recruiter to walk through the brief, answer any questions that the recruiter may have, clarify anything that I may not have been clear on or got slightly wrong. And then in the run-up to testing, so once recruitment is underway, then there's checking participants, confirming that participants are suitable. Not every recruiter works in that way. As I mentioned earlier, some will just go off, do the recruitment, confirm the participants themselves, and then just come back to you with a list of people that are coming in. But this would be my preferred way of recruiting. I just wanted to give a little bit of a nod to doing recruitment yourself, because it is a thing that comes up. It sometimes happens, and I've had to do it myself sometimes as well, and I have to confess I am not a fan. I respect your job a lot for doing it, because it's really hard work, and I think the times when we've done it, us and our clients, you massively, massively underestimate how much time and effort and resource actually goes into recruitment. It's tough, and it takes a lot of time and patience. So my general advice would be don't, but I am aware that it does sometimes happen. So I just wanted to touch on what happens if you do have to recruit yourself. And actually the process is, I would go through the same process if I was doing it myself. I would write myself a recruitment brief, and do the desk research, the stakeholder interviews, and perhaps then some of them workshop activities that I spoke about, so that I'm very clear with myself who I'm looking for and why. Then I'd have to write a screener, which oftentimes I don't have to do. A recruiter often does that for you. So a screener is when so people are perhaps responding to your advert that you want to do recruitment. They're the questions that you ask to check that they are actually suitable for the bit of research that you're running. And if you're doing recruitment yourself, you're going to have to think about things like where is appropriate to recruit, how are you going to recruit, and make sure that you've got loads of time for reaching out to people, replying to questions, booking people in, confirming them, thanking them when they've taken part, paying incentives. There's lots of extra things to think about. So there's a lot more information on that, and in fact everything that I've spoken about today in a book that I wrote with James Lang on doing user research in UX. So I think we've got a link to this on the last slide, but you can pick it up on Amazon or SitePoint itself. You can get a digital version. That's the publisher of the book. But there's more detail in there about doing recruitment and writing a brief. So if there's anything that I've not been clear on or people want to know about, they can find that in that book there.
Great. So I'm going to take over and just talk briefly about general data protection, which is the General Data Protection Regulation, which when it came into force in May, I think companies suddenly started thinking about how this needs to be factored in to the recruitment process. And we've got a section on our briefing template which we use with new clients who maybe are new to working with us or new to running research, to make sure it's covered really. So just 3 things I'm going to really briefly go through, and by all means, if you're listening, either now or later, and you think I would love to learn more, send us a message on Twitter to say please do a webinar on GDPR in user recruitment, and we'll do one. Mitigate risk where possible. Put the participant needs first, because essentially data protection law is all about just protecting individuals. And consider if you require special category data. So for anyone that doesn't know what special category data is, there's a list on the Information Commissioner's Office website. It includes things like sexual identity, ethnicity, religion and health, which are things that we have to include in recruitment most frequently. If you do need to capture this information, process data relating to this or control data relating to those things, you have to make sure you're asking for explicit consent from the participant to do so. Mm-hmm. A few things that we do to mitigate risk is anonymisation. Wherever possible, we try and anonymise any data that we're capturing and sharing with our clients. So things like taking people's full names off participant lists, or separating that information. So you've got information on in one place that says the schedule and Judy coming in at 9:30, and then having information about who she is and potentially sensitive information on a different bit of paper, so that if there is a data breach somewhere, you're reducing the sort of impact of that. Reduce who has access to any data, just so that it's easier at the point at which you need to remove access. You know that less people have had access to it, and you've got to go to less people to say, please destroy that participant list that we printed out on the day. And reduce the data that you store. So do you really need all the information that you're capturing, or all the information that maybe a recruiter is giving to you once the research has taken place, and once you've done your summary and your analysis? So if people haven't fallen asleep yet, just...
What are you saying about my talking?
I don't know, the GDPR, maybe we should have got that boring bit out of the way first. So to summarise everything else that we've gone through, no, definitely it was great. It was actually really refreshing to hear you say things like writing a brief is hard and it's easy to get it wrong, because I would say the times when recruitment projects haven't gone to plan it's times when we've had a brief sent through, and maybe the client hasn't had the time, or they've been out of the country or running other research and haven't had the time to have that call with us at the start of the process. Because some terms that we see included in briefs are often open to interpretation. So I felt that it was really just nice to hear a lot of the stuff that we know works for us, and that you've got that same opinion. So we went through the purpose of a brief, why it's important, and I think, again, you raised a valid point that even if you're doing the recruitment yourself, or maybe you've got a colleague internally that's helping you with the recruitment, that it's still a useful process to go through to nail down who it is that we need. I've lost count of the amount of times when our clients rang me in a panic a couple of days before the research and I didn't actually book a room, we're going to have to change the date. So at that start of the process, 2-3 weeks before you're running the research, making sure that you've crossed all those T's and dotted the I's. Depending on how easy it is to book a room in your office. What should be included in a brief? As I said, we've got a link at the end of the presentation with a bit more information about the basics that should be included. Communicating with your recruiter, as I said, it's just so important to use this as a tool to communicate and make sure that you're all on that same page. You definitely feel confident that you're the person doing the recruitment, whoever they are, whether they're an internal person or an external agency, definitely is going to get people that you need for the research. The time frame involved, so where possible, giving people extra notice if you can. I know it's not always possible. And obviously GDPR considerations. So that leaves us 10 minutes for questions, which is very exciting. Okay, bit of a long question. So this one says, we went to town a bit on putting lots of information in a recruitment brief, shared it with the client, and then the client came back with lots of questions and extra information. Okay, so it sounds like having a very detailed brief perhaps triggered quite a complex process. So this question maybe it's 2 questions in one here. So how long should a brief be, and what kind of, where's the limit with when there's too much information in there? And then perhaps maybe a secondary question about what's the best way of managing client expectations if you're going to share the brief with your client. So I don't know if you want to tackle the first question.
Yes, the first one about length of a brief. I think, so mine are certainly never over 2 pages long. Be good to hear what you think, actually, because I think it goes back to thinking through the different variables that you might need. So, you know, I spoke about the essential variables having no more than 2, and then having no more than 7 secondary variables. So really, you shouldn't need more than 2 pages, otherwise you're starting to get into the territory of creating a really overcomplicated and quite difficult recruit for your recruiter. So I definitely limit it. So the template that I showed, if I can get it on 1 page, that's cool. Sometimes it will drift into 2, but I'd say it's never more than 2 pages, not the recruitment briefs that I put together anyway.
Yeah, that sounds like a good length.
Yeah. Then the second one, so around, it was around client expectations, wasn't it? So I definitely think that when you're working with a new client or project team that maybe haven't gone through this process before, working with them quite transparently and openly at the beginning, so running through a workshop activity like the one that I described, is really helpful for clients like that, because then they can see the process that you've gone through and they've got that understanding, right, we know we can only have 2 essential variables in here, we can have no more than 7 in here. So it kind of creates boundaries from the beginning for them. And then I tend to find the more that you work with a client, the less hands-on they want to be with the recruitment, because they understand the process, they trust that you know their audience or their customers, and then it becomes less necessary to run them type of workshops with them. So I think it's about taking a client on a journey with you and letting them be a part of it and seeing what you do so that they feel involved. That would be my recommendation.
Yeah, they sound like very sensible recommendations. I think particularly using that workshop, one of the things I suppose I would add to that is if you're defining a user group too much and putting things like age, gender, and I think we discussed before we started the webinar earlier on today, sometimes you'll see personas with photographs as well, and lots of fluffy information, which sometimes is good to help if organisations feel quite removed from their customers, to get them to see their customers. These are real people. There's Barbara at home with her cats, actually taking some of that off, because otherwise if you've got stakeholders viewing your research, they might go, well, I thought our customers were all called Barbara and they all have cats. This person doesn't look like they own cats. And getting your client to be prepared for what their customers might actually look like. A lot of companies who maybe haven't done research, don't have UX teams, and maybe don't have the same sort of user-centered approach to how they build their products, maybe aren't prepared to sort of see what their customers really look like. It's
a good point. And I think again, going back to them sort of workshop activities, it does get people to focus on behaviours and traits, rather than, like you were saying, things like what someone looks like, or focusing too much on things like age, which actually might be quite irrelevant.
Yeah, because ultimately, if you're working on behalf of a bank, if this person is a customer of that bank, then their views surely do have some validity in that process at some point.
Yeah.
Okay, so next question: if you were to recruit internally, how would you manage a recruitment list? I don't know, this perhaps ties in with a time when you've had to do the recruitment yourself. I don't know if you're
so there have been times actually when a client's given us a list of customers to recruit from, and sometimes actually that can be really helpful. So the times when that's happened, I've actually I think there's been a time when I've worked for people for research on a project like this, so where we would hand over that list to the recruiter and ask them to recruit from it. So we'd still go through a very similar process. We'd have a brief. So from that list of X number of people, we want to talk to, this type of person and this type of person. And what's been good about that is we've asked for advice on, how big should the list be? So if we want to talk to 10 people, then I would hope that my recruiter would be able to say, you're looking at a list, you need a list of X number of people, and it is always way more than you imagine. So that's how I would do that one, is I'd get the list, say thank you very much, and scurry that off to a recruiter and hand it over to them to recruit from that list. don't know if you've got any sort of thoughts on.
Yeah, always come to a recruiter. No. Yeah, there's a few things. So there's GDPR is obviously really important. If you're going to be sharing data externally, you need to make absolutely sure that those people have definitely opted in to have their contact details shared externally. Even though we will act in an appropriate way, we cannot access that data unless those people have consented. Again, this is the sort of thing that I could quite happily run a whole nother webinar on and talk for an hour about, but making sure that people have opted in. If they haven't, actually just going back through that process again, which really doesn't take time. You can set up a survey on SurveyMonkey, send a link out on a newsletter, provided people have signed up to a newsletter, and allow people to opt into your process. And we've actually done that on behalf of clients, where we will set up the link, the client can send that out, and with that link they can say, this link will take you to People for Research's website, where you'll give your details to them, and then it's really clear that the participant is opting in, and we have clear messaging where we're saying, if you give us your details, it won't be shared outside of us, it'll be used just for the research, etc. You were talking about numbers, so the sort of size of list really depends on how often you engage with your audience and if they regularly engage back. When we're going out from our kind of database and our network and community, as we like to call them, of people that have opted in to hear about paid research, we will often say a good response rate is 30-1. That's when using a tool maybe like LinkedIn. That's when we're targeting people who we know are suitable and we're sending them relevant content. If you don't know that you're going to be contacting people that are suitable, so for example, if you're going to send an email out saying we're looking for people that have bought something, a particular thing, if you don't know whether you're definitely going to be emailing those people who have done that, you probably do need a bigger list, because a lot of those people are going to see it, it's not going to feel relevant, and they maybe won't respond, so you'll probably need to send it to a much higher number, maybe 100 to 200 people for every one response you want back. So the list can get quite big, so if you want 10 people, you're looking at maybe needing to email 1,000 or 2,000 different people. So it's quite difficult to give very specific information until we know a bit more about how often you engage with your customers at the moment. And I think it's also important when you're trying to recruit, also thinking about how you're going to explain to your customers that recruitment process. I mean, we're going off tangent from the recruitment brief a bit, but this is the sort of thing that if you spend that time working out the brief, along with that you can identify, okay, well, who is it that we need? And as you said, how are we going to target them? And are they definitely relevant? So if we did send a mailer out to people that we think have this type of subscription to our service, and they come back and it turns out they don't have that type of subscription because your own data is maybe a bit outdated, could you still include them anyway? Because if that person's putting themselves forward to say, I'll spare an hour of my time to help you make this service better because I'm a customer and I really want to help you with this, consider whether you can include them to kind of keep a good relationship. I've got quite a few more questions, so we'll try and whiz through, and we might run a few minutes over, so if people want to bear with us. Can you give any common examples of things being left open to interpretation?
Being left open to interpretation?
I'd say things like the word regularly.
Yeah, because so at the bottom of the template that I shared, we have, and it's something that really bugs me and I need to get time to think about it, we have internet behaviour at the bottom. So we will say things like regular internet user, and you're right, what does that even mean? And why are we asking for that? I think it's good to reflect on the language that you're using and why you're asking for it. But yeah, that is a good one. So what is a regular user? How can you define that? Because what I think is regular might be different to what the recruiter thinks is sort of regular use.
I think it links into the workshop that you ran, Emma, at UX Bristol this year, about bias and assumptions, and actually it's worth running the workshop that you got us to run in that workshop, where you look at the points at which bias can be introduced, because if you're writing that brief and your view is something, actually the recruiter might have a different assumption about what regular is, because they're going to be they'll have different behaviours to what you do. Okay, so language, I would say, is probably the biggest thing that's open to interpretation. So what's your opinion on over-recruiting, from Sarah?
Do it. Generally do it, because to mitigate the risk of no-shows. So let's say I want to talk to 5 people on a bit of research. generally what we'll also ask for is either a 6th participant or an all-day standby. So that all-day standby is someone that we can call at any point throughout the day. So if participant 2 drops out, I can get that person in. And I think it's the times when it's really important to do that is particularly when you have a client watching, because the worst thing that can happen is if you've got an hour with your client sort of sat in that test room and you've got no one to test with. So I'd recommend either over-recruiting by 1 or 2 or getting an all-day standby for each day of testing, just to make sure you can fill your slots.
Great. We've got one more question which we'll go through, but if anyone needs to drop off now, we will be sharing a video afterwards, and I think if you've signed up you'll automatically get a copy of this afterwards, so you can skip to the end to anything that you're going to miss if you need to drop out now. So just on over recruiting, from my knowledge of the marketplace, I think an average rate of dropouts is about 10%. Our rate is lower because we've got a very thorough process of screening and confirming participants, but yeah, you just never know what's going to happen, and it's much better to be prepared than have a room full of stakeholders twiddling their thumbs for an hour. Do you put together a screening document?
So actually, often working with a recruiter like yourself, that's something that you do for us. This is another nod back to the book. In the book that I mentioned that I wrote with James, we have got a section in a chapter about writing a screener if it's something that you find that you're having to do yourself. But working with someone like Jess, you'd put together a screening document on our behalf, wouldn't you?
Yeah, and it's another part of the process that, from a recruiter's point of view, working through the screener and trying the recruitment brief and trying to translate it into a screener is a really great way to prepare for the recruitment process, make sure that we do fully understand all of the information that's in there before we embark on actually picking up the phone and screening people. And I think our preference would always be to create the screener, but I suppose I don't know if person Megan that sent this in actually does the recruitment herself, but I would say if you are doing the recruitment yourself, definitely create a screener. Don't just sort of pick up the phone to people and hope that you'll remember what you need to ask them. I think particularly thinking about how you'll introduce it. So for example, if you are recruiting customers, how will you start that call to say, right, I do just need to run through some questions to check you're suitable, so that people don't think that the screening process is the research and think that they're going to get because often occasionally we'll sort of email people or maybe message people on LinkedIn to get them involved in research, and people say yes, look forward to talking to you on the 25th, and they just kind of haven't read the full content, and that's why it's good to go, no, we do need to have a quick chat. And also from a transparency point of view, the screening process is a good point to actually say to the participant, you're going to be talking about this thing, are you comfortable? So with the Talk to Frank project, actually saying, these are the things that we will cover, are you comfortable? So making sure that people are aware that you're not going to be asking them anything that's too invasive, or if you do need to ask some personal questions, that people feel prepared and they can give what's known in the research industry informed consent. So that during screening they can say, actually, you know what, I don't feel comfortable participating, I'm going to say that I won't be included. And again, you know that you're being definitely sort of ethical with your approach. Okay, so we're going to wrap up. As much as I'd love to keep talking to you all afternoon, hopefully it's been really useful. So I'm just going to go on to the final slide, which is useful links. Hopefully that covers the majority of what we've discussed. If you have any questions, you've got Emma's Twitter handle, my Wolfie. My Twitter handle, MPFR, or contact People for Research or cxpartners if you want to chat about user recruitment or actually doing some research. Great. Thanks to everyone who joined us.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me. It's
been a pleasure.